Right, ladies and gentlemen, so we are going to be moving on to our next revolution, which is the French Revolution. As a reminder, what we've already gone over is we've already gone over the Enlightenment, and we saw with the Enlightenment some of the justifications behind the revolutions that we'll be going over in this class. Remember, we saw thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We saw with Locke's ideas of life, liberty, and property and the social contract that if the government, whether it's a king or a republic or any government, did not uphold its end of the deal, then the people had the right to abolish that government. And that was a major justification for the American Revolution that we discussed last time. Today, we'll be looking at the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, we saw that Rousseau was this more radical Enlightenment thinker who wanted that direct democracy, while John Locke wanted a republic. Rousseau was very much about direct democracy, having the general will of the people. We also briefly talked about the fact that Rousseau sees these institutions as very corrupt. So he sees governmental institutions like the king and the queen and the nobility as very corrupt organizations and institutions, and he wants to get rid of them. His basic belief, if we really look at the state of nature, is that all people were very peaceful, but it was these institutions that started to make people violent. And we'll need to remember those justifications as we look at the French Revolution today, because that will help explain some of the radicalism that we see, especially during the Reign of Terror with Maximilien Robespierre. Let's go ahead and begin with our essential questions. Once again, we'll just look at the first two. What were the causes and effects of the political and social revolutions? We have already seen one of the causes is the Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau offering a justification for these revolutions, but we want to see the more proximate causes as well. If you'll remember, whenever a government overtaxes its population or restricts its population, we also get some revolutions occurring. So just as we saw in the American Revolution, we'll see some of those proximate causes of the French Revolution. And number two, why did nationalism begin to rise? And what were the positive and negative effects of this new way of organizing societies? One phrase that we'll actually go over in class today is King of France versus King of the French. What we'll see is that prior to all of these revolutions, people organized themselves based on who the king was. They said, well, that's the King of France. I live in his territory, so he's my king, and that's how we organize our society. But we will see this shift to King of the French. And King of the French, even though it's a little different in its spelling, it has massive differences in the way that people view the world. When we say King of the French, people start to think, well, wait a second, I am French, and I am French because of my language and my history and my culture and my heritage, and I'm going to hang out with other French people who are just like me because we have a national identity. We just happen to have a king who runs the government for us. And so we start to see that this idea of the power coming from below and that organizing people based on who they are and not based on who the king is going to become the dominant way of thinking. Once again, that's a very minute difference, but it has very drastic changes for Europe. Let's go ahead and begin with our anatomy of a revolution right here. So we need to look at the causes. We've already talked about Rousseau. Let's look at the more proximate causes. Remember, these causes include a bankrupt government taxes its citizens, government fails to respond to the needs of the people, and then restrictions are placed upon the government. So taxes, the government not responding, and restrictions placed on the people. That's what we're looking for in this first part here. Let's start with bankrupting the government. This is King Louis XVI. As you can see, he's very pompous looking. This man obviously spends a whole lot of money. I didn't even need to really tell you that. You could just look at the picture and assume that, because that's exactly what he looks like. Now, King Louis XVI is an incredibly weak ruler. He's just not that great at being king. He's great at living the king lifestyle. Like, he spends a whole lot of money. He lives in the Palace of Versailles. But when it comes to actually like managing a society, taxing the citizens, like doing all the tough stuff of being king, yeah, he's not very good at that at all. Now, what he attempts to do is he attempts to reform society. at least somewhat, in order to please the serfs. But this actually greatly angers the nobility. And as we saw all the way back in Unit 1, the kings always had to worry about the nobility. Even though we've seen more and more centralization of power with the kings, they still have to worry about the nobility. The nobility can still challenge their power. And we see that here. So the nobility prevents these reforms from occurring, so everything stays the same. King Louis XVI will pay for the French and Indian War, as we saw, or the 7 Years' War if you're looking at the European theater. But what we did not talk about in the American Revolution is that the French greatly helped the Americans by giving them a whole lot of money in order to defeat the British. Well, that's going to bankrupt the government, those multiple wars. And so the government's going to need to pay for that. Somehow they're going to eventually tax the citizens. Now, here is how the tax works, or here's how society is divided. And this is a little bit confusing here, but it's important to keep in mind. Society in France was divided into three estates. The first one was the clergy. So the clergy were the priests, they were associated with the church. They made up 0.5% of the population, but they had 10% of the land. Yeah, so 10% doesn't really seem that much, but when you're only have 0.5% of the population, 10% of the land is a lot. Think about, like, if we were in class, this would make a lot more sense. But think about having about 35 of you in class. I give you two whole pizzas and I keep one pizza for myself. Yes, you as a class have significantly more pizza than I do, but I have more pizza per person because I have just one pizza and I don't have to share it with anyone else. I have it for me. That's how the clergy is. So, yeah, collectively, they don't have as much land, but they have a lot more land per person. It's the same thing with the second estate, which were nobles and very close friends of King Louis XVI. They made up about 1 to 2% of the population and had 25% of the land. The rest of the French society, all the other 98%, were the peasants, or the serfs. They only owned about 65% of the land. Now, most importantly, they paid 100% of the taxes. This is actually the reverse of Robin Hood. Robin Hood steals from the rich and gives to the poor. The taxes are on the poor in order to benefit the rich. And if we're going, when we talk about wealth, we're talking about land. So if you have land, you have wealth. Those things are synonymous with one another. And so the third estate that doesn't have much land or wealth is paying a whole lot of money in order to help the people who actually do have a lot of land and do have a lot of wealth. So we see that a bankrupt government taxes its citizens, and obviously this is going to greatly upset those citizens once they figure out that this is kind of the name of the game. In addition to this, whenever we have revolutions, one of the proximate causes is usually food. It's always interesting how people are willing to put up with horrible things. They're willing to suffer a whole lot as long as they're able to survive. Once they're not able to survive, once they do not have food, then all of a sudden a revolution occurs. This is the first revolution that we'll look at, in which bread, or the lack of bread, is a cause for the revolution. We'll see later that the Russian Revolution starts for a similar reason. That lack of bread, the lack of food, is a major cause for the revolution. There's a bad crop harvest in the winters of 1787 and 1788. This leads to high unemployment, rising prices. This leads to a lack of food, but the French are still spending a whole lot of money on wars and a lot of money on other things and upkeeping the Palace of Versailles. And so these peasants are seeing that, thinking, well, wait a second, how come King Louis gets to live in the Palace of Versailles and do all these wars and do whatever he wants while his own people are literally starving in the streets? This hardly seems fair. And this is ultimately what's going to start to cause people to want to revolt. Now, as with every revolution, there's always peaceful attempts made in order to kind of deal with the issues before we actually get violent. And there always needs to be that. You can't justify violence if you don't first try peace. And so their first attempt at peace is to meet in the Estates General. The Estates General is just a collection of representatives from all of those classes. So there's representatives from the clergy, representatives from the nobility, representatives from the third estate. They all meet together in the same room, and they're going to discuss ways to fix the society. Clearly speaking, peasants or the third estate is going to say, hey, taxes are a big reason why people are starving and dying in the streets, so let's go ahead and reform those. What we're going to see is that King Louis XVI is going to vote them down. And here's how this works. Instead of voting by head, in which every single representative gets one vote, the Estates General has people vote by blocks, as in there's only three votes. You're in the clergy has one vote, the nobility has one vote, the third estate has one vote. Well, the clergy and the nobility are very close to one another, so they're always going to outvote the third estate by a score of 2-1. So when the third estate says, hey, we want to lower taxes, they get outvoted 2-1. The third estate then says, well, wait a second, this is massively unfair because we have way more representatives and we represent 98% of the population. We should vote by head. King Louis XVI and the other nobles threaten to use force against the third estate if they keep talking like this. And the third estate says, that's it. We're marching out of here because we tried this whole peace thing. You made it impossible for us to reform our society via peace. So now we have to resort to violence. JFK said something like that as well. I forgot the exact quote, but JFK, John F. Kennedy, pointed out that if you don't allow people to change society peacefully, it's not that they're going to just give up and go home. They're just going to change society violently. And so we get the first step of the revolution, which is the revolutionaries need to unite. 98% of the population needs to come together and focus on their goals. They need to unite and organize. We first see this at the tennis court oath. So King Louis XVI has kicked the third estate, the representatives of the third estate, out of the Estates General. What these representatives did is they located themselves on this local tennis court that wasn't too far away. And what they wrote together was the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. They said that we want all of these changes to our society. They also said that they are going to stay united and will not give up until they get those changes. So now we have revolutionaries uniting and we have revolutionaries making impossible demands of the government. The revolutionaries have said that the king can no longer be an absolute monarch. An absolute monarch is someone who has total control over everything. The king can do whatever he wants. What these people want is a fairly moderate change. They want to have a constitutional monarchy. They still want a monarchy. They still believe that a king is a great form of government, especially in traditional France. They would absolutely love a king, but they want a constitution. This constitution creates something called a rule of law. Now, what is that? What does that all mean? A rule of law society is a society in which the constitution is the highest law in the land. We in the United States live in a rule of law society. Every single person, including Congress people and the president, must obey the law. At least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. This is opposed to a rule of man society. A rule of man society places one man, or I guess it could be a woman, but it's usually a man, at the top of the society. That's how an absolute monarch works. An absolute monarch is a rule of man society in which everyone must follow the law except for the man at the top, except for the king. He can pretty much do whatever he wants. So we see that this is a very moderate change. They're calling for limited constitutional reform. Let's have a constitution. Let's open things up to the nobility a little bit, maybe even give them some rights, but let's limit the power of the king. That's the whole idea of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It is notably not what the radical Americans wanted. The more radical Americans wanted to have a republic or a democracy or something where every single person votes. That's not what the creators of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen wanted. They did not want a republic. They didn't think that every single person should vote. They really thought that the nobility and the middle class should have more rights and the king should have less power. That's really about it. But because this is a demand of the government and because people don't like giving up power, the king does not want to cede. The king does not want to give up that power. So we see that this is an impossible demand of the government. We also see that their demands include individual rights like universal male suffrage and religious tolerance. And once again, when we talk about universal male suffrage, we're still just talking about the middle class. It's not necessarily everyone. It's very funny how the word everyone gets thrown around at doesn't actually mean everyone at all. So when we say, oh, they wanted universal male suffrage, well, yeah, they wanted the right to vote for the middle class. But for all those serfs and peasants over there, no. For women, definitely not either. They still wanted that constitutional monarchy, as I talked about. And then the last one is this idea that I talked about at the very beginning, where you are loyal to the nation and not the king. Prior to all this, you're loyal to the king. Long live the king. God save the queen. That's that's who you are loyal to. But this idea of loyalty is starting to shift, where no longer are you loyal to a person, but you're loyal to a nation. It's no longer king of France, but king of the French. You are organizing yourself based not on who the king is, but based on who you are. Now, the call of the French Revolution is going to be liberty, equality, and fraternity. That is going to be a very famous phrase from the French Revolution. It's important to keep that in mind. Now we get the government attempts to suppress the revolutionaries and fails to do so. Storming the Bastille, a mob of Parisians, a mob of people in Paris, stormed this prison called the Bastille. Now, this prison actually didn't have that many people in it. I believe there's only like 6 or 7 people by the time they actually mobbed and stormed into the prison, but the prison had a whole lot of weapons. So the people had to go arm themselves. The people arm themselves and they start to fight against the governmental institutions. This happens on July 4th, 1789, and this is actually my picture of the July poll. We're actually not going to talk about the July monarchy, at least not too much. Maybe we'll mention it with the revolutions of 1848. But this is a different part of French history, but right here is where the Bastille stood. This is my picture. I was happened to be in Paris, and went out that day for a jog in the rain, and this is the picture that I was able to take with my phone. So yes, the Bastille stood right here. This is where they stormed the Bastille, took the weapons, and started to fight against the governmental institutions. One thing I do want to note: this is how people in Europe drive. Like, you think Americans are bad drivers? Like, California is notably bad at driving. Same with Massachusetts. Like, they're known as awful drivers, but Europeans are by far the worst drivers I have ever seen. Look how close they are. Like, that's ridiculous. All they do is just drive around and honk at one another, and they don't use turn signals or anything like that, and they speed all the time. Enough about Europe. Let's go ahead and move on here. Now there's a fear of the domino effect. So other European countries, Austria, Prussia, pretty much every European country, is worried about something called the domino effect. That if this French Revolution works, people in their country are going to look over and say, "Hey, the French they rebelled against their king, and that worked out well for them. So we should rebel against ours." And that's obviously going to be a massive problem. So other kings want to reinstall King Louis XVI. They want to put him back on the throne, and they want to say to everyone in Europe, "You mess with us, we're going to kill you. So don't mess with us at all." This leads to a much more violent stage of the French Revolution, in which the French are fighting against themselves, the French are fighting against Austria and Prussia. There's just massive amount of chaos, massive amount of warfare. There's pretty much no government. It's just all violence all the time in France during this time period. And yet it will get worse, as we'll see in just a second here. We also see this rise of nationalism, which is essential question number 2. What we see during this time period is that more and more countries are going to start making these flags, and they're also going to have these national anthems. In order to unite the people. And the reason for this is because people are becoming much more nationalistic. They want to organize themselves based on who they are and not based on who the king is. So this is where we get the famous tricolor French flag, and this is also where we get the national anthem. We'll see other examples of this when we talk more about these nationalistic movements in Unit 6. The revolutionaries finally gained power. In 1792, King Louis XVI is overthrown, and his famous wife, Marie Antoinette, is overthrown as well. Marie Antoinette famously did not say, "Let them eat cake." The way the story goes is that Marie Antoinette was looking at the people out of her window in the Palace of Versailles, and she's like, "Why are they all rebelling?" And she was told, that they don't have bread. She said, well, let them eat cake, which either showed that she didn't understand the fact that they didn't have bread, or she just didn't really care about them at all whatsoever, or both. She actually probably didn't say that. That's just the story behind it. But why ruin a good story with the actual facts there? Let's go ahead and move on here. What we see is that King Louis XVI, as I was saying, was overthrown. He's arrested. Marie Antoinette is also arrested. Both are eventually taken to the guillotine, and both of them are killed. Once you kill the king and queen, once you're able to mentally justify killing the king and queen, it's not really hard to justify killing anyone else. And we're going to see a lot of that in just a second here. France is going to be proclaimed as a republic. And actually, in order to better understand this, let's talk about the radicals. So, this is the part that the American Revolution never went through. The American Revolution had its causes. The American Revolution had its war that was going on. I mean, the revolutionaries had to unite, and then they skipped steps 2 and 3 and just went on to victory. That's not what happens with most revolutions. Most revolutions work in the same way that the French Revolution does. Now, what happened is that you had these moderates, right? You had the moderates with the tennis court oath who wanted to have a constitutional monarchy. But then you have radicals. These radicals, like Maximilien Robespierre from the Jacobins or the Jacobins, depending on your pronunciation, wanted to put in Rousseau's ideas. Remember, Rousseau believes that it should be the general will of the people. Rousseau also believes that these institutions created by man are just pure evil and make people awful. Well, when you if that's your view on society, then there's no way that you're ever going to support a constitutional monarchy. You would say, no, that doesn't go far enough. We still have horrible institutions and we still don't have the general will of the people. And so these Jacobins under Maximilien Robespierre wanted a republic. That is very, very radical. And so, because they are so radical, the moderates don't want to satisfy them. The moderates sit there and think, well, we want some changes, but those radicals over there, those guys are nuts. We don't want to listen to them at all. The radicals over there then go, wait a second, these moderates aren't going to give us what we want. Now we're going to have to take it from them by using violence. And that's ultimately why King Louis XVI is overthrown, and him and his wife Marie Antoinette are sent to the guillotine, because these radicals believe that that's the only way in which they're going to be able to satisfy their desire to have a republic society. Now, Maximilien Robespierre takes over and is the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. This Committee of Public Safety, its job is to exterminate the enemies of the state. Just a lesson from history here. Whenever you hear a leader use the term enemies of the state, be very aware and be very, very scared. Because throughout history, whenever anyone uses enemies of the state, that's just a broad general term for anyone that they don't like. And what we see is that enemies of the state can be anyone who happens to disagree with your point of view on life and on government and politics. And they will just use that justification in order to kill you, as we see with the reign of terror here. The Committee of Public Safety finds enemies of the state, especially many domestic ones, people who anyone who wants to have a monarchy is a enemy of the state. So you can see that many people are going to be sent to the guillotine. 300,000 ultimately are going to be arrested, and anywhere from about 25 to 40,000 people are going to be sent to the guillotine, which is illustrated for you right here. It's a very simple and easy device. Put the person here, let the blade fall down, their head falls in the bucket right there. Now you might say, well, 17,000 or 25,000, whatever it is, that doesn't seem like a lot of people. The reign of terror only lasted a year. That's a lot of people who were killed within 1 year. This is actually where there's a lot more information I do want to give with this here. This is a major critique of the Enlightenment. So when I went over the Enlightenment, I've said the Enlightenment is great, and I was actually a huge fan of the Enlightenment because it allows people to express their desires. I mean, the people are the ones who get to vote. The people are the ones who get to make decisions instead of having decisions made for them. But this is where people start to critique the Enlightenment. They say, well, look, this happened because of the breakdown in social order, because people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau started to question the social order and fabric of society. all of this violence starts to occur. In addition to this reign of terror, this awful violence, isn't due to anything religious. We often associate religion with violence, and we saw that with the Crusades. We've seen that with other religious wars like the 30 Years' War. But this violence happened due to reason. I mean, Maximilian Robespierre sat there and thought, okay, we need a republic because we need to make a better society. And how do we make a better republic? Well, we have to kill anyone who's opposed to making a republic. I mean, he used reason and logic in order to arrive at something that is absolutely awful. Adolf Hitler is going to do the same thing with the Holocaust. It's not going to necessarily be religious. It's going to be something that's more rational and logical. Adolf Hitler is going to say, well, we need more Lebensraum, we need more land, and so we need to kill a bunch of Jews in order to get that done. So we see that there's this critique against enlightenment. There's maybe this almost counter enlightenment, in which people say, hey, using reason and logic and science doesn't always lead to a better life for people. Ultimately, that's up to you to decide if the enlightenment is a good thing or a bad thing. And it doesn't really matter which way you choose. You're going to have very strong thinkers on both sides of that argument there. We also see that with this reign of terror, there's a destruction of the old institutions. So there's this wanting to destroy the monarchy, which is why King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were killed. And also the reason why anyone who supported a constitutional monarchy was going to be arrested or put to death. But we also see that there's even an attack against the church, that the church was this old institution that subjected people and forced rules upon them, and that the church needed to be gotten rid of. The radicals even go so far to get rid of the calendar. They see the calendar as being created by the church and these monarchy institutions. And so they get rid of the calendar, like January, February, March, April, all that gone. They institute a new calendar that has months like Thermidor in it. That is true. That's a real story there, that they truly did change the calendar because they saw that as oppressive and the ways of the old institution. Eventually, actually, as I have here, Robespierre is going to be found as an enemy of the state. So Robespierre was arrested on 9 Thermidor in the second year. Once again, it's a real calendar. For our translation, July 27, 1794, and he was put to the guillotine. Now, once Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety are gone, in comes the French Directory. It's this 5-person committee. It's incredibly weak. That's all we really need to know about it. Whenever you have this weak government, it cannot prevent chaos. And whenever there is chaos, people just want the chaos to be over, to be done with. And so what they will do, they will always, all throughout human history, it just repeats itself over and over and over. They are going to vote for security over freedom. What I mean by that is people will say, look, I'm willing to give up my right to vote. I'm willing to give up freedom of speech. I'm willing to give up a lot of things if there would just be one person who would come in and stop all of this chaos. And that person is going to be Napoleon Bonaparte. It just happens to be this way for the French Revolution, but in almost every revolution, there's a strong man that emerges. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was born to an Italian family on Corsica, the island of Corsica, in 1769. There's a lot more stories I would tell you in class, but I'm not going to waste your time in the video here. Eventually, he gets into a French military school, works his way up through there, and eventually he takes over France in a coup. A coup means he overthrows the French Directory, and he himself becomes the leader in 1799. In 1804, Napoleon is so popular that he crowns himself emperor. He puts the crown on his own head. He says, I am the emperor. Everyone has to obey me. And people are more than willing to do so because the people of France are sick and tired of all the chaos. And they look at Napoleon, they say, hey, this guy is stopping the chaos. This guy is bringing our country back together. He's stopping people from killing each other in the streets. And now he's getting us some military victories outside of our own country as well. So they absolutely love this guy, even though he acts a lot more like a military dictator, of which the French Revolution was very much against. Napoleon is an incredibly impatient individual, and he thinks that offense is the best defense. So he starts going to war with all of these other European powers, and he's incredibly successful. The man cannot lose between 1792 and 18, well, not quite 1815, 1814 or so. He just doesn't lose. He just continues to fight, and he continues to bring honor and glory to France. And the people of France just continue to love him because of all of this. Now, the major part that we need to see here is not so much Napoleon's battle strategies, although I would like to go over those, or even the stories about how he goes into Russia, which I will go over in just a second. But because Napoleon is fighting all over Europe, he brings the ideas of the French Revolution to everyone else. These ideas of voting for all men, the ideas of religious tolerance, the ideas of no absolute rule, the ideas of getting rid of feudalism, the ideas of having a constitution, all of those ideas of the Enlightenment are greatly expanded upon all throughout Europe and very, very rapidly. You have to remember, yeah, even though we had our big Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it's only really the rich people who are reading those. I mean, after all, it's only really the rich people who can read. It's not really the serfs or the 90% of the population that would actually be able to mobilize and put in these changes. That's not until Napoleon Bonaparte. Once Napoleon Bonaparte starts to take over Europe, these ideas not reach not only just France, but all of Europe, and not only just the nobility in Europe or the middle class, but the serfs as well. Now, these European powers are going to establish 7 different coalitions to try to fend off Napoleon. Eventually, they'll be successful here. In order to kind of show you here, this is Napoleon's empire. So everything in purple is now has at least now been introduced to the ideas of the French Revolution. So all of these areas right here. And that is, I don't want to say there's an immediate change, because there's not. It's not like overnight, all of a sudden, these people are like, huh, let's have religious liberty and let's let everyone vote. But the idea is planted. It's like a seed. Ideas are like seeds. You gotta give them time to grow. And so Napoleon's very much planted the seed of the Enlightenment all throughout Europe, and that seed is going to grow throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s as well. Napoleon eventually overextends. He goes into Russia in the winter of 1812, and very famously, the Russians use both time and the weather to their advantage. Here's what the Russians do, and this is great. So Napoleon, let's use the map here. Napoleon is invading Russia. He's going towards Moscow. He continues attacking, and no one can stop Napoleon. He's just too great at what he does. The Russians know that they're not going to be able to defeat Napoleon on the field of battle. So they just turn around. They just turn around and start walking this way. They just retreat. And you might think, well, wait a second, how is retreating going to lead to a victory? It's because the Russians are patient. The Russians have a whole lot of time on their hands. And so they just retreat. Napoleon goes after them, they retreat. Napoleon goes after them again, they retreat. They let Napoleon take Moscow and burn it to the ground. And they just stand outside of Moscow. And Napoleon sits there. He's like, well, wait a second. I can't fight the Russians, so I won't destroy them, but they also won't surrender. So what am I to do? And so Napoleon sits there and he waits and he waits and he wonders what the Russians are going to do. But then the winter comes in. The Russians, they're used to the winter. They're born in the winter. They're molded by the winter. They know how to survive in the cold. The French, they don't. They had started their campaign in the summer, so they didn't have their winter gear. And look how far they are from France. There's no way that they're going to get supplies all the way from France to where Napoleon's army is. So Napoleon eventually has to turn around and go back because of the Russians' patience and because of the horrible, terrible winter. Of the 600,000 troops that had invaded Russia, only 40,000 come back. And so Napoleon is incredibly weak. And King Louis the 18th, who is, I believe, the grandson of King Louis the 16th, takes back Paris and restores the monarchy. At this point, Napoleon is exiled to the island of Elba. He is never seen again, never heard of again, and no one really knows what happened to him. Except that Napoleon came back. Yeah, Napoleon never goes away. So Napoleon escapes the island of Elba because he's Napoleon. He's just great at what he does. He goes back to Paris in 1815, and he has his 100 days. He reunites everyone. He says, hey, guys, we're getting the band back together. We're going to take over everything. Once again, King Louis the 18th and the other leaders of Europe say, absolutely no, that's not going to happen. And Napoleon loses to the combined British and Prussian forces at the Battle of Waterloo And this time, Napoleon is exiled not to anywhere in Europe, but all the way down here in St. Helena. So even if he escapes, there's no way he's going to make it back to Europe. And eventually he dies in 1821. And there's a lot of things that are a lot of monuments put up in France to help remember Napoleon. This is the Arc de Triomphe. As you see, it's very large there. And this is the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, which my French is horrible, but this is my own picture here. This is actually just outside the Louvre. What's the legacy of all of this? Okay, because that's actually what's important. It's not the fighting, it's not the story about the Russian winter, it's not Napoleon. The legacy of the French Revolution. The first part instituted a constitution, and that's incredibly important. This idea that the king should not have absolute power, but should be limited by a constitution, begins with the French Revolution, and because of Napoleon, is spread throughout Europe. The idea that the king should be limited in their power is incredibly important. Opening careers based on talent and not family. So once again, this meritocracy, like we saw in the Song Dynasty all the way back in Unit 1, now the Europeans want that. They think that that's a good thing. Those Enlightenment ideas, such as religious tolerance, are spread all throughout Europe. We also see the abolished feudal system in France. So all these serfs who were tied to the land because of feudalism, well, now they're free. They can stay on the land if they want to, or they can start to move into the city. No longer is there going to be heavy taxes on the lowest classes in order to benefit the upper classes. Now, the feudal system will eventually be gotten rid of in all of Europe by 1860. Russia will be the last one to get rid of its feudal system, but that's only because the French Revolution started this idea that the feudal system should be gone and it should be gotten rid of. The idea of equality for all men, that there's such thing as equality for all people. It's not that kings and nobles are born better, but that everyone should be treated equal. But we still see that there are some things that don't change. They subordinate women. Women are still seen as very inferior, as we saw with Mary Wollstonecraft back in our Enlightenment lesson. We also see that the French bring back slavery in the French colonies, that we'll talk about more when we look at the Haitian Revolution. And we also see this big one right here, the massive standing armies. Prior to Napoleon, you didn't necessarily have a huge army, but Napoleon was able to unify everyone together and make these massive armies, massive amount of infantry, which is ultimately why he was so successful, or at least one of the reasons why. In response to this, other European countries are going to build up their armies. We'll see 100 years down the road with World War I that all of these European countries, because they have all of these massive armies, are willing to use those massive armies. So part, and this is kind of stretching it a little bit here, but part of the reason that World War I occurred is because of Napoleon creating these idea of massive standing armies. And then we've already talked about nationalism. So this last part here is just that. It's changing the way that people think about governments and think about the nation as well. These are the results. I've actually gone over all of these as well, but you'll go over them again once you start working on your comparison chart as well. So ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our lesson on the French Revolution and Napoleon. In our next lesson, we'll be looking at the Haitian Revolution.